will be kind of filtering through. That's fine. See if I bring this up a bit. Bum, 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 bum. What? A little Wagner? What's wrong with that? Well, yeah, we need to get started one way or another. This evening, we'll be continuing what I kind of loosely started last week, looking at parables, or parabolically, yeah, it doesn't really work, parable adjacent usages. I'm using the most generous definition because we're going to look at two this evening, and they're both, the first is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the second is found in Matthew and Luke. And we're going to be taking them both from Matthew, from within the Sermon on the Mount. And their figures we're probably pretty familiar with, but it's fun to dig into and treat in terms of the idea of a parable being something which is the physical ideas for a spiritual truth. So the first is going to be from verses 14 through 16 of Matthew chapter 5. Also Mark 4, 21 to 25, and Luke 8, 16 through 18, and that's the lamp on a stand. Now, technically, this also includes the city on a hill. He uses that figure as well. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. These are ones that are used quite often, almost to the point to where they're just kind of an expression. We use them in pretty common usage. Pretty common parlance. Let's read New American Standard, 1995 edition. Christ is speaking. Sermon on the Mount, that makes sense. Oh, I should see, that's the questions we're supposed to ask. Anyway, you know this. Christ is speaking. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand. It gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Okay. So we have, this is pretty obvious. You've got Christ as the speaker. Who is his audience in this particular situation? Is it more general? Is it directed at someone specific? Well, his disciples are present, and they'll be listening to it. In the Sermon on the Mount, it is a little more open. It is to the particular crowds. And more specifically, it's a circumstance, and we'll find this in other cases. Luke kind of breaks some of these things up into disparate places. So the question is, did he say these things multiple times? Probably. And Matthew kind of pulled it into one big glob, or is this it doesn't really matter. Typically, a lot of times Christ will use these figures in response to a question, or response to a complaint, or in response to an accusation coming from his enemies. And instead of trying to directly answer his enemies, though he does some, he does it more for the group watching, for the crowd, for the masses. He's answering for them. And when we say the group or the crowd, who would these people be listening to him in the first century? What would their background be, generally? Okay, Jewish people. That's important, though. It is of the Jewish nation. So are they what we would call unchurched, or unlearned? Were they unfamiliar with God or any of those particular things? No, the opposite. He's speaking to those that are believers, that have a certain degree of information. He's also in the Sermon on the Mount trying to break through a bunch of junk that they'd been taught for a while and bring them back to where they needed to be and to elevate their thinking. That's what the sermon is largely about. It's, you have heard it this way for a long time. I'm going to challenge you to raise the thinking to something grander with a higher focus. All right, so he says uses these descriptors. We have the different figures. We have light, and he says light of the world. Now another gospel will reference him talking about being the light of the world, and that's John, meant in a slightly different way. Here he's saying they, or his followers, or those to whom would be the ideal representatives. They're the light. Well, that's weird. I thought he was the light.
So that reference to would excite a Jewish person thinking that, yes, indeed, we are the chosen people. We are the light of the world.
There is an element of that, yes. God described them that way. You were a light unto the nations when they were supposed to be. They were also an incredibly bad example when they weren't who they were supposed to be to the nations.
They always assumed they were right.
Yeah. So you have this figure of light, and so he doesn't mention it, but we can do this. When a figure is brought up, you can then think, okay, what's its opposite? What is light in contrast with? Okay, darkness. And that can be representative of what? That opens up a whole bunch of things. When you have light versus dark, that's representative of... Okay, exposing things. Light brings evil things to view. Good and evil is mentioned. Just God's people in the world is another contrast. And it can be simply information, enlightenment in terms of ignorance and knowledge. Yeah. You're aware of what's going on. Okay, you have sight. Sight comes into play. Now, is he speaking of something physical here? Obviously, it's a physical concept, photos, with a spiritual significance. We'll later see that even those who physically see can be blind, and those who are physically blind can see. It's about spiritual truths. He also uses the figure of, light will become important with the lamp, but he also talks about a city. And some make a big deal about that. He's talking about Jerusalem. He's talking about the church. He's talking about these various things. He's talking about heaven in the Revelation, the heavenly city. He actually doesn't have to be talking about any particular city here, because he's using it as a simile. A city set on a hill. Does that ever sound strange to anyone? It depends. It depends. Yes, it's also harder to get water and supplies to. So there's a trade-off. You typically put a fortress on a hill and a city in the valley. But there are different times. Jerusalem was set on a hill, and it was a fortress city. That's why it took them a very long time to take from the Jebusites. It was several hundred years until David finally took the city from the Jebusites, the city of Salem, where Melchizedek had been, the Jebusite city of Salem, hence Jebus-Salem, Jerusalem, Jebus-Salem, same city. But Jericho was down in a bowl and heavily defensible. Putting one on a hill wasn't typically the first choice unless you had another reason to do so. He's not actually talking about something that was the norm. But what is it about the city on the hill that makes it different? What's he say about it? So it cannot be hidden. Standing firm. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden away. You can't disguise it. You can't make it blend in. It's not surrounded by trees in a forest. It's not in a, I don't know how you hide a city anyway, but it really stands out. And here's the thing. Say you're journeying at night from a distance, the lights of that city are going to stand out versus other places. So it's about, is he saying Christians should be subtle? Now, I mean, we need to be wise, we need to be smart, but he's not saying we need to be hard to find. Where we're at should not be hard to find. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. You are the light of the world. And this is going to carry over to 15 and 16, which are more of the figure. And of course, both the ones we're going to talk about today are VBS songs. You know, this little light of mine and so forth. Hide it under a bushel. No! I'm going to let it shine. I think sometimes we go, ha, that's great, and we don't talk about these kind of ideas because, that's kids stuff. This is Christ in Sermon on the Mount. This is not necessarily. He is a masterful communicator in the Sermon on the Mount. Someone suggested it's a 4th to maybe 6th grade level. Oh, well, that's so... No, it's because he was so well at communicating heavy ideas with simple concepts that children can pick up on it, and then adults, and then we ruminate on it and can dig deeper, right? So let's look at the figures here. We've got lamps. Lamp. We got a basket. Oh, that did not work. And a stand. Okay. A lamp. How did they have lamps in the 1st century without electricity? I was just being, yeah, I was being pithy, but yeah, they're oil lamps. Some people do think that everything begins with a switch, but they had oil lamps. Oil has been used for those purposes from various sources for thousands of years, even up until the late 1800s. The discovery of oil, like oil in the ground, saved the whales because we were murdering them in mass number to get oil for lamps and various other things. We just did. Oil lamps. Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to see. I don't know how low to go with this idea here, but how basic is what I'm going with. He just says a lamp. Why would you put a basket on a lamp? Well, why don't you just turn the light off? Ever thought about that? It's like okay, fair enough. They had flints, but you know, but that's the thing is that you put a basket. That's like a fire danger. I always in my head had this notion of, right? That's not quite what he has in mind. But notice the way it's phrased. You don't take a light and hide it under a basket. He says that instead of, you don't take a light and snuff it out. There's a subtlety there.
The idea, the way I understand it, is that the light is still there. It's just hidden.
But see how it, okay. The light's still on, it's just not projecting as well. See, basket can fit, it can fit with almost the idea of a shade even. It doesn't necessarily have to be a whole cover. I always had the impression before of like just boom, but it actually can be something pretty big, like you set it down inside something to contain it. And if that's in view, that kind of changes a bit of the understanding what he's getting at. There's a certain subtlety there. And it hits home a little harder, actually. Because let's take these physical ideas and let's relate them to the spiritual concept. What is the light that he's talking about? Well, I mean, I guess I already asked that question. But if it's for us, then...
Metaphorically, in my mind, the light is where we share the existence of the spiritual realm. We share existence of God, deity, that people of the world wouldn't see without us giving them guidance. The concepts that are spiritual that are not readily available to the rest of the world.
Okay, so spiritual truths, things that don't come through everyday, it's revealed things, maybe the way to put it. Spiritual truths God has given to us that we can just hold on to and know and make us feel better, right? Yeah, we have all the secrets. No, but see, isn't that what he's getting at? Now again, he's speaking to an audience of people who actually don't have all the information we have, is the thing.
But he's speaking to an audience that has been given scripture, biblical teaching, all of their life.
This is true. They have information that the rest of the world doesn't have. It's just important to remember, he isn't delivering this sermon entirely for that audience. He knows it's going to be recorded and have lasting value beyond. He is preparing them for the kingdom. He uses that phrase a bunch, in the coming kingdom, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of the kingdom. So that these things can then be remembered. Remember, he's relating this. Matthew is recording this because of inspiration, of perfect memory of what he saw, ex post facto, after the fact. with information that now has even more bearing on the Christians. When Christ is saying you have a light, oh, well, we have even more light. What did they have in the first century? They had the old law, they had promises of a Messiah, they had a whole bunch of other junk that they had to get out of the way, and they had John's baptism and this preparation and whatever Christ was teaching them. They had the excitement, they had the fire. You could say that's the light.
In a similar context, weren't they already supposed to be, as God's people, God's nation, a light to the world around them?
They were.
They were supposed to be visible, and this would carry it farther
Yes.
through the new kingdom.
Yes, they were supposed to be a light unto the nations, or an example of God's people on earth. And the weird thing is it kind of worked in just ways you wouldn't expect. How many times do we run into, you go into the Gospels, Christ will bump into Gentiles that demonstrate better faith than his own people. And he kind of marvels at it. He runs into a centurion. Some part of me always wonders, is that Cornelius? Because he's doing really well later on, too. He's the one that's like, you don't even have to come and heal. You just say it. You're a man of authority. You just say it, and my servant will be healed. And he's like, you got this figured out better than any of these people. Where did this come from? Well, where did their knowledge come from? Someone who was a Cornelius, or someone that it came from some of the Jewish nation sharing what they say. A lot of them wouldn't bother because they thought that they were holding it in for themselves, that they were the special ones, but not everyone. So that information was getting out. Now, if we carry it over to the Christian age, we have light. He doesn't say hide it under a bushel. He says, hide it under a basket. He doesn't say snuff it out. That hits more home. Because it's easy for us to go like, well, I haven't denied him. I haven't stopped believing. I haven't turned the light off. Is that what he said? How useful is a lamp that's stuck down in a barrel in the corner on the other side of the house? What do you do with it? Well, you have the lamp, you have the basket, and you have that other element. You have the lamp stand. Okay, that's meant to elevate it and then share it throughout the house. They knew what they were doing. They had various lamp stands. Some try to relate back to the lampstand in the temple. I think that's a bit of a reach. What's the idea of a light that's prominent? And it echoes back to the city set on a hill. It's prominent. Again, I might use the word obvious, not secretive. And again, with wisdom, not being foolish, but he's describing an attitude. You have this information. Is it so well known that you have it that someone could ask you just based upon how you behave, how you live? Or are you trying to share it? There's that impetus there. Now, I have a couple questions kind of getting into this idea. How does this fit in the overall Sermon on the Mount contextually? And I've already alluded to verse 20. So I say to you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's the key verse of the whole sermon. So contextually, he's talking about, and he talks about a lot of things in the sermon about their expectations that the Pharisees had set for them. And he's like, this is what is expected of you. This is what God expects of you. He's trying to, this is higher than that. It's better than that. Don't just do the bare minimum of getting attention. See, Pharisees were great about getting attention from their fellow man with prayers and with, but they weren't sharing light. And that's an interesting contrast, actually. We're told to pray, give in secret, but he earlier says, let your light shine openly. Well, is that a contradiction?
About what you see, feel, hear, touch. And it's about the five senses. And so, this opening, was to tie in about God to the rest of the world, to make them enticed to be, let me have some of that.
There is a certain reality to that for their own purposes. They had allowed God to be like one of the others of the world, even the Pharisees. So the Romans didn't come and conquer them right away until they decided to revolt foolishly. They made an agreement. They made a sacrifice on behalf of the emperor once a year, which on paper is that really a terrible thing? He's the government leaders that exist. Okay, but they had turned it into this very cynical thing of, well, we're going to do lip service to the state that we really hate and we're going to talk about. But, they'll leave us alone and we can be our people and our thing with our God, and that's a problem. Because when you turn God into a localized God in name, that's what they're doing. He's our God. All those Gentiles are doomed because he doesn't love them. He's our God. That's the same as being even if you're rejecting Zeus and all of them, you're limiting him. And what is Paul's sermon on the Areopagus? He is the one God who created everyone, and all of man came from one. That's a pretty wild statement even for a Jew at a certain point because of how poisoned their thinking had gotten, at least in the first century. And so he is challenging them. And it's not just make sure that you're a good person and people see that. That's like a rudimentary, maybe a Sunday school way of looking at it. But if you're going to elevate it to, I'm not trying to take away from that, but if you elevate it to the Christian walk when he's getting at, okay, what is our light? And it's not enough just to have it. How tempting is it in everyday worldly situations? You got to trim on that lamp. You want it high enough to where God can see you're there, but you don't want it up too high because that might get a little too much attention. Let your light shine brightly, he says. And ultimately, it's not our own light either way, because if you want to use another metaphor, we're the reflection. We're like the moon, and it reflects the light of the sun. Yeah, we have nothing in and of ourselves, so all those ideas are there. There's a lot that we can go with this. Let's see. How does this fit in the Christian walk? I've been talking about that. How does this describe does this describe actions alone? This is kind of what I've been alluding at last week and so forth. Is it just about what we do, or does it include the why and how we do it? Is it easy to kind of, even with the great intention, when you're trying to reach out and help someone because you're supposed to, and you're kind of trimming that light back down because you're not demonstrating that full heart and characteristic that goes with it, if that makes sense. And here's a question. Is this describing the body or individual Christians? What? You can't say both. It's an or question, Eric. But yes. Because the body is the collective of individual Christians. But we're only as good as each and every one of us.
We have responsibility and accountability as individuals. But the unification of the body compels us to be better.
Certainly. All right. Any other thoughts on that one? I know it's like, and everyone's kind of, yeah.
One thought earlier was reference to when you pray, go into your closet, keep it to yourself. But that was a teaching against self-aggrandizement kind of thing.
Yep.
Which is totally opposite to what sharing the truth is about.
Oh, yeah. And that's the problem, is that people conflate certain, well, he says this here, and he says, and they're not understanding what he's getting at. Yeah, it's against self-aggrandizement and whose attention you're getting. You're actually trimming your lamp down when you make it a show about you, because you're making it about your own you're putting, it's another way to put a basket on there when you make it about you.
Well, then you finish that, which lights are shining before men so that they see what your good works. All right? And then
Glorify him. Glorify him, yeah.
glorify God. So number one, and this is something this is the catch. They see your good works. Well, number one, you have to have good works within the scene.
Yeah.
If you don't, they don't see it. There's no light. But they don't
It's outside the norm of everyday life, which is an unfortunate thing. That's the sad thing about the world. It's not something we should revel in. It should make us,
Well, that's the hard thing about 21st century.
should break our heart.
So many deluded, confused, pretend Christians that stand out there that say, well, and so there's this hint of good morality
Yeah.
that permeates Texas, Waco, but that's not what God really called us to. We should be different, and we're not.
Yeah, certainly. Well, let's go to the second one, unless there's a little bit more. And it'll be a familiar one too, a VBS song with this. The two foundations in Matthew 7, 24 through 27, and Luke 6, 47 through 49. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, contextually, this is coming right off a pretty heavy section, and it's important to keep it tied to that, but we'll read 24 through 27 that closes out, in essence, the sermon. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Much like Usher. That's a vague reference. You have different figures in this one then. You have a what? What's being built? You have a house. And does it have to be a single unit dwelling, a mansion, it doesn't matter. It's a dwelling, okay? So you have a house, and then you have the building surfaces, and that's a contrast between rock and sand. You might have to have a survey done to figure out what kind of sand. No. What's the defining characteristics of the two surfaces, ultimately? One's solid and one is not. Is building a house on sand a really good idea? I'm not a contractor nor the son of a contractor, but it sounds like a disaster, actually. So you have another contrast then, the builder. And one is wise and one is foolish, as we do this song. One is wise and one is a fool. Now, what does a fool mean? Not necessarily in 21st century elements, but in the first century, especially the Jewish usage of fool. What the biblical idea of a fool? Is a fool someone who is incapable or challenged in some fashion? Not typically. Okay, empty-headed, lack of thought, maybe acting on impulse. Well, in his description, he describes this person as, well, in both cases, it's someone who is hearing his words, hearing what he's telling them, and then the choice they make. Do you act on them or not? So there's an element of will here and choice, and it's someone who is making a bad choice. That doesn't mean that they're a, per se, idiot or any of those things that would say they're incapable. They're just making the wrong choice. A fool, many times, actually has the capacity to make the right choice, and that's what makes it a tragedy, in essence. Now, sometimes you could say, well, they missed out. There's a difference between ignorance and foolishness. Ignorance is a lack of information. Ignorance is not an excuse before the law. Ignorance is not bliss, and that's why it's important to have people give information. But in this case, this person is not ignorant because it says, here's these words of mine. The information is given. They just make a choice. And he says it's akin to building on a foundation of sand, which sounds really dumb. But what is dumber? What is more foolish? What is more, I don't know the pejoratives I can use. Yeah. Your house falls down, or your soul is lost. I mean, what is worse, really? One other element in this that sometimes is forgotten is the storm. What is the storm? Life, The world? There's no right answer to this one. It's one of those rhetorical things. It can be, yeah, challenges, hardships, persecutions, difficulties. It is seen as an inevitability, not as a what if, but as a when. And in the spiritual sense, it's kind of the idea of walking down a path. It's not a question of when an obstacle will come in your spiritual, if one will come, but when and how. And Christians can develop certain obstacles that the world doesn't get, because we are tempted in ways the world can't be. When you encounter various trials, because you're being tested. That means you're a target. Satan isn't going to bother with someone who he's already defeated.
Jesus said, in this world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer.
Yeah. Well, then again, that would then also mean something else, possibly, though. A lot of times we can read this and go, yeah, okay, one guy is the godly person, and one guy, the fool, is ungodly. He's evil. No, he doesn't say that. No. Is the foolish man building on the sand opposed to God? Is he even opposed to Christ?
What makes him foolish according to Scripture is not following the teaching.
It's very possible for him to be a follower of Christ. Oh, that's hitting a little too close to home. I prefer it's like we're the ones with the rock, the world's the one with... No, the world actually isn't in view here. He's talking about someone that Christ at least has heard what he has to say, but if you want to make it very personal, knows what they should do, and they're making choices. They're making choices. Now, why would someone not build on the rock? Well, but why? And again, it's why would someone not listen to what Christ has to say? I mean, he's perfect. He has all the things. Why would anyone do that? Well, unfortunately, it's a common problem. 24. Petra, that's what I thought, yeah. The word used for rock is the same one used, it's bedrock. It's the same one used as in the confession of Peter. So, on this confession that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So it's Petra, it's bedrock. I was curious about that. It's Petra. Why is the rock a benefit? That's kind of obvious. Stability and form. See, here's the thing. You can build a really, really, really good house, right, on sand. The houses can be exactly the same. Is he focused on the quality of the house? It's getting back to the foundation. See, this is going to come into play heavily when we get to the parable of the sowers and who that's going to involve. Because it's not who you think sometimes. Huh. Okay. How do you know if you're building on a sound foundation?
So, if he hears these words and do it, as opposed to hear these words and do it for not.
Okay. But how do you know?
You hire someone like John Pizmeyer to check it for you.
Okay.
In my mind, the way I see this is like, here's an instruction manual. Okay?
Hmm?
Here's the instructions. Follow the instructions, everything will be right. Don't follow the instructions, it's on you for not doing what the instructions say. If it falls apart because you didn't use the right tools, didn't do the right stuff, it's on you because you didn't follow the instructions.
If you don't first succeed, then read the manual kind of concept.
Yes.
If you don't succeed, hit it harder. Yeah, no, that doesn't actually work. Yeah, read the manual. Well, and again, contextually, this is like, well, I did have another question. How obvious is the foundation? That's an interesting one. Because you might think, in our minds, we have these pictures of this is just giant, like Prudential Rock or whatever, or I guess that's Gibraltar or whatever, something like that. And you're just like, and you just, bam, it's like right there, and then sand. But how obvious is it, actually, necessarily? Where you're standing. You just say, I know, I'm fine. Or does it take a little bit of digging, a little bit of introspection, a little bit of looking at, is my behavior in line with what it should be? A little bit of work, maybe. Again, digging down. Some take this in a way it's like, oh, this guy, he knew he was building on the sand. Not necessarily, he just didn't care to look or care enough to examine where his priorities were.
The way I've always seen this is that the houses theoretically are identical.
Mm-hmm.
The results are determined in the storm.
Mm-hmm. When the test comes.
In the storm. That's how you know. Now, you can't see the foundation. The foundation's underneath the house. The evidence comes in the storm.
Yep.
How they respond.
Yep, how they're tested. Now, if you think about how this fits in the overall Sermon on the Mount, this immediately contextually, and this is why it's like, the wise man built it. It's a happy little VBS song, we do that. But this immediately follows, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. This condemnation of people who thought they were following him, but there was a distinct difference. And that's then verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father. They weren't doing the will of the Father, which echoes down to, he says, therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them, ergo, the will of my Father. It's that defining difference. And a lot of times we think in terms of, I'm on team God, or I'm on team Satan. No, it would be much simpler if it was like that. But this is describing those who were claiming to follow him, but they weren't following. They wanted to be on his team, but for whatever reason, they didn't do what he wanted, or strive to do all that he wanted. Maybe they did some of it. They just wanted to change this or twist that around to different things. They're building a beautiful house. And from the perspective of everyone else before the storm comes, like you said, it could be identical. It could be gorgeous. It could be grand. They have everything figured out. This could be that follower of God that looks like everything is figured out because everything is stable until the storm comes. And you could argue even just contextually, I don't know if this necessarily fits, but the storm could even be just judgment. You know, when all is said and done, which foundation actually is going to prove to have been real? You know, I don't quite know if that's what he has in mind, but it flows really well.
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be wrong either because we've seen people that live poor lives and still seem to be successful.
Yep. Is this directed at the world? Is this directed at ungodly people? They're not the ones in the audience. How could a godly person build on the sand? A lack of spiritual maturity or a lack of spiritual curiosity. That's maybe one way to put it. It's like, well, I heard someone say X. That's probably fine. They don't make it their own. It's not personal. Or, you know, I was around. Yeah, but whatever. It'll be fine. It'll all shake out in the end. Well, it'll shake out. It'll be your house.
And I think that goes back when you were talking about the definition of a fool. Like you're not talking about someone incapable.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about someone who willfully is blind about something. Like, I know what's there, but I choose X anyway.
Yeah.
Because I feel better about it. The view is better from the sand than on the rock, so I'm building my house on the sand because that's what I want to do.
Yeah, you got to.
Willful, blind choice.
You got to build on the beach until the hurricane comes. You got to build on those hillsides in California along the PCH, the Pacific Coast Highway, which are always falling down whenever it rains. And I don't know how they get permits, but they are always falling down because they're not stable. But the view is wonderful. Okay, how they get insurance? Now here's the thing. It's just kind of relating to us, and then we can kind of wind it down. How does this describe just going to the right place? Well, I go to the right place with the right people, and they do the right things. That might be true. What about you? Where's your foundation? Does this describe actions alone? And that's still that idea of, if you're trying to emulate him, you can put on the show of building similar things, but without the right heart, without the right attitude, without the right mind, without the right methodology, if you like the word term, might fit the idea of you're building in the wrong place. How useful is a beautiful and giant building, edifice, mansion on a bad foundation? How good is that in the long term? Won't withstand the storm.
Another thought is you can build a beautiful house on a beautiful foundation, but if you don't fasten the house securely to the foundation, the house is going to blow away.
That is true too. It needs to be connected, yeah. And that could fit too with someone, it isn't quite his metaphor, but it would be like being Christ adjacent. And I have this idea of like, well, I want to, it's like trying to half see it. It's like, well, I want the security of the rock, so I'm going to tether like this much to him, but I want to live my own life, so I'm going to build the rest over here. It's not going to cut it. One or the other. And the last question I kind of had was, what kind of storms come into the Christian life? Do we have any unique storms, unique temptations, unique issues? We certainly do. And some of the things that either tear a house down that shouldn't, or expose a weak foundation, they're not the things you expect typically with Christians. They're those things that we struggle with perhaps and try to take care of on our own. The temptations, addictions, and it doesn't have to be evil things even. It can be just things that take place of God. Our own frustrations, our own timetable, our own desire to have things worked out. Our own pride. Pride is the oft-forgotten problem. Again, contextually, it ties into the verses right before it, but I do also believe that he's speaking of the entire sermon when he says, hear these words of mine, because he closes with this.
Right at the end of this, he says, he lives here.
Let him hear.
Here's the text.
If you want to build on something solid, you've got to have an attitude that's elevated beyond what you know, is what he's telling this crowd. Something better. So, yeah, there's a whole lot that's there. So, we could dig into this further, but that was the end of my question. So any thoughts, issues? Okay. Well, this was kind of what I was wanting to do. 1, 2, 3, depending on their length, here and there. And since the class schedule can vary a little bit, because we have different things going on Sunday evenings, and we'll have projects and stuff, I thought it was flexible enough, because we're not tied to like, if we, I wanted something that would be independent enough. So, any other thoughts? Does anyone need to partake this evening? Lord's Supper. Are there any announcements that need made? Something we heard, since I know Becky left because of the great-grandbabies. Okay, well, better is good, but prayers for them certainly. They're so small. Okay. Is there anything else that needs mentioned? Got our meal on Wednesday. Same bat time, same bat channel, and so forth. Okay. Well, if that's all, Chris, would you close us in prayer?